The warm-up for the deadlift still needs to be somewhat of a full body warm-up. Head to toe, your entire body is going to be involved on deadlifts. One of the differences between the deadlift versus the squat and bench, there's not a lot of deep flexion in your joints in any of these movements. The starting position from the deadlift is going to be the time which you have the most flexion in any joint, which will be at the hips. Warming up the joints with movement comes before we start warming up the muscles with weight. Because there's not a lot of deep flexion in any of the joints for the deadlift, it doesn't require as long or deep of a warm-up as it would for the squat or bench. Again, the primary joint here is going to be the hips. There's some involvement with the knees, very little with the ankles. Most people don't require any sort of warm-up with the shoulders, but if you have stiff shoulders or you feel a little better, you can do something with the upper body. The shoulders aren't going to be moving during the deadlift, but supporting the weight from the bar may feel better if you warm them up as well. So the main primary joint in the deadlift is the hips, because we're doing a hip hinge, a lifter's wedge to perform the deadlift. The best way to warm that up, you could do some RDLs with very minimal weight on the bar and just grease and groove that pattern of warming up at the hips. If your knees do feel achy on any of the deadlift type movements, you can do some sissy squats or some leg extensions to get that joint warmed up. We do not warm up the back as a joint because the back is not supposed to be moving during the deadlift. It's supposed to be staying rigid and supported, not moving. Because of that, we don't warm up the back with a movement. We warm it up with the big three. The big three, hopefully you have watched that video, is going to create that rigidity and that residual stiffness throughout our core that's going to allow that to carry over through our entire deadlift workout, because the back is not warming up, it's not flexing, the back is staying rigid, and we need to warm up and prime those muscles that support it. The advantage of deadlifts and starting with the bar on the floor, you can take all the time in the world with either an empty bar or one plate. If we're warming up the joints still, you can just do an empty bar or one plate and do deadlifts or RDLs until you feel your joints are properly and appropriately warmed up. Some advanced warm-ups that I like to do and I've seen successful, a lot of people, myself included, we walk around all the time kind of being tense, and a lot of our gym movements are very tense in the traps. So one thing that I like to do is actually stretch my traps out. Generally, any sort of static stretching prior to lifting is not a good idea. However, sometimes I'll just take a 35 or 45 pound plate and hang it in my hand and kind of let my trap depress a little bit and not be so uptight. If my traps stretch out a little bit, I can actually get a little bit more length to my arms, and that will help my leverages and my range of motion in the deadlift. So that's kind of an advanced warm-up that if you have tight traps and tight upper body, you can kind of get those to loosen up a little bit prior to deadlifting. If you're pulling sumo, you may have some restrictions in your hips, but again, we don't get into a deep hip flexion position with the sumo deadlift. However, it may be beneficial for you with one plate on the bar to start with a narrower stance, perform a few reps, and continue widening your stance out until you're at your max width stance that you prefer for the sumo deadlift. Your hips are warmed up and you're ready to go. After we have warmed up the joints through movement, then we move on to warming up the muscles with weight. This is when we start adding weight to the bar. The joints are ready to go. Now we're priming up the muscles, getting them warmed up before we get to working sets. The golden rule of deciding how much weight to put on each set as you're warming up is this: the size of the increases need to decrease or stay the same. That means you can do a 50-pound jump, a 50-pound jump, a 40-pound jump, and a 30-pound jump. But what you can't do is a 50-pound jump, a 60-pound jump, a 65-pound jump. So every time you add weight to the bar, how much you increase it needs to either stay the same or decrease as you approach the weight that you're going to use for those working sets. That covers the warm-up section of the deadlifts.